On today's episode of TLC Hot Topics, we'll be speaking with an exceptional leader in the nation's energy industry and a strong voice for diversity and inclusion. Please join us. Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to TLC Hot Topics. We are really excited to have you join us today. I'm your host, Danny Vargas, National Director at the Latino Coalition. In addition to these podcasts where you get to hear from inspiring guests, we also have a series of webinars where you'll learn great information on how to run your business and how to become more successful and thrive. I'm pleased to introduce our guest speaker today, Mr. Kwame Canty. Kwame is a Senior Director of External Affairs at Edison Electric Institute. He joined EEI's Political and External Affairs team in 2015. EEI is the association that represents all U.S. investor-owned electric companies. Their members provide electricity to 220 million Americans. They operate in all 50 states and the District of Columbia and directly employ more than 500,000 workers. Kwame works on EEI's outreach and education and lobbying efforts to members of Congress, national policy organizations, community-based organizations, and other key industry stakeholders. His background and experience working with a broad constituency base will be a great value add in explaining how the men and women of the utility industry work with each and every day to provide power to America. He's a native of Brooklyn, New York. Kwame understands the value of being a dedicated public servant. Prior to joining EEI, Kwame was Director of Programming for the Congressional Black Caucus. Kwame, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's so great to have a fellow Brooklyn native on the program with us. So We'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Indeed.
I don't want to get into that. But before we start, why don't we take a few minutes and you sort of explain your journey of how you got to where you are today?
Well, it's pretty disjointed. If I were to peek back behind the curtain and talk to myself in 2003, I don't think, my 2003 self would believe me if I told them what I was doing and where I'm at. Primarily because, most of the people that are in public policy or politics sort of have a background in that space. I didn't necessarily come up that way. A lot of people cut their teeth when they're really, really young. I mean, I did when I was young. But I started out when I graduated from Hampton University. I started out working for 311 as a call dispatcher. And then I went to the Department of Education in the Power Registry. And I had to get up and be at work around 4 a.m. so that I can make calls to substitute teachers to let them know which schools they were going to that day. So that was one of the jobs I had. And then I got a job at Cola Goldwater Hospital. My major was actually in physical therapy and therapeutic recreation. And I got a job at Cola Goldwater Hospital on Roosevelt Island in New York. And my unit was C4344. And I had about 40 patients that were under my care. And it was a city-run nursing home. And it was one of the most rewarding experiences of my sort of working career. Unfortunately, I lost that job and I was out of work for 6 months. And a woman by the name of Marilyn Mosley, who is a Rotary Club president in Central Brooklyn for this organization called PAPA. And her son was a former state assemblyman. And essentially, she took me under her wing because she saw me grow up. I grew up in a very large tenement building in Brooklyn, as most people did growing up in apartments or what have you. And my mother told her I was out of work, and she said that she would help. And she did. The person that she helped create a meeting with was my local congressman, Ed Towns. And I got my start in the district office on Geralman Street in downtown Brooklyn in the office of Congressman Ed Towns. and I did constituent services for him. And I was outgoing, and I wanted to help people. And I remember being when I was out of work for those 6 months, praying, asking God. I said, look, I want to do a couple things. Whenever you bless me with the opportunity to get a job, I want to wear a suit every day. I want to be in a climate controlled atmosphere because it's hot out here. And sometimes it's cold, and I need to be inside. And I want to help people. I want to do all those three things. And public service was the door that was open to me. And it's been a marriage ever since.
How'd you get into EEI?
So as most folks that work on Capitol Hill, I was sort of poached off the Hill, if that makes sense. So I said I started out in the district office for Ed Towns. I subsequently, I was made aware of all of these sort of non-for-profit apparatuses that both Congressional Hispanic and Congressional Black Caucus have set up for kids that grew up like me, that didn't have a whole bunch of wherewithal, but still should have been provided opportunities and pathways. And so through the Congressional Black Caucus Institute, they had a week where they were going to train local staffers and other lay folk about campaigns, campaign networks, how to campaign. It was a week-long boot camp. And part of the programming was a day on Capitol Hill. Now, I had not been to Washington, D.C. since like my college tour in like 1997. And I know you're familiar with D.C. D.C. in the 90s was a very interesting place as far as the aesthetics. And coming from Brooklyn, I was like, I need a change in scenery. And so fast forward to this boot camp, get down to DC, and I had never been to the Capitol building before this particular time, and I was 26 at the time. And I met all these Congress people that I had sort of watched on TV and seen interacting with my then boss, and I was sort of in awe. And I knew at that moment, I said, I got to get the hell out of Brooklyn. I need to be in DC. This is where the action is. And I ran into a young woman who I'm still friends with today. And I know God put her in my path because she and I share the same name. Her name is Kwame Anderson. And obviously my name is Kwame Canty. And she worked for Maxine Waters. Bumped into her. Obviously, we were enamored that we had the same name. And so we struck up a conversation. And I remember telling her, I said, look, sister, I want to be down here. I'm in Brooklyn now. I love, working with Mr. Towns. It's great. I get the chance to sort of serve the community that I grew up in. But this is where my heart is telling me I need to be. And she says, brother, I'm going to help you. I'm going to send you some job postings from USA Jobs. You apply, figure it out, and see what happens. And the one that she highlighted to me was a bill clerk in the office of the clerk of the House. And for those that don't know, the clerk of the House is part of the functions of the House of Representatives. It's a civil service role. Most of the employees there. But that particular role is politically appointed by the Speaker, as well as the parliamentarian of the House. The parliamentarian sets the rules for Robert's Rule of Order and essentially calls balls and strikes. The clerk, essentially is the name. She operates all of the functions and duties administered within the House to make the House function as a government entity and a business within a museum, if you will. And so I come down, I meet Kwame. She sends me a job posting. I apply to that job on a Monday. By Wednesday, the hiring manager, Francis Chaparty, emailed me about coming down for an interview on Friday. By Friday afternoon, I walked out of there with a new job. And I had to move within 2 weeks. So you talk about like within a 2 week span, my whole life changed because I was in, Baltimore at this boot camp, come to DC for this meeting. I get emailed by the essential job posting that I, forwarded my resume, cover letter, and all my information to. And within a 2 week time period, I had a new job and had to relocate out of Brooklyn, a place I lived in for 26, 27 years. So that whole shift in my life in 2006 really set me on a trajectory. And I got to DC and I worked on Capitol Hill for almost 9 years for 3 members of Congress, in addition to working for the clerk of the House. And my last boss that I worked for was G.K. Butterfield out of North Carolina. And EEI subsequently hired me from his office. But I went from Congressman Ed Towns to working for the Congressional Black Caucus for then Chair Marsha Louise Fudge, who is now currently the Secretary of HUD. And then again, I said G.K. Butterfield was my last boss. He was the CPC chair in 2015 when I left Capitol Hill.
What an incredible culture shock. Moving from Brooklyn to DC, and then moving from the Capitol Hill to such a large, important nonprofit like EEI that's had such an impact on the private sector. You talked about a couple of things that really struck with me. I mean, I, as a kid from Brooklyn as well, black and brown kid from Brooklyn back in those days, that didn't grow up with much. Mm-hmm. The expectations weren't very high. Nope. Statistically, I tell people I should be dead or in jail right now. Yep. But you also mentioned something that really struck with me. You talked about how, by the grace of God, a lot of us, we go through life and we sort of just try to figure out what we're going to do without a grand scheme or a grand plan. But, as long as you're open-minded and willing to take that leap of faith, I think what makes the difference. Is that something that you found in your case with not only your story, but others around you, that it is just that leap of faith?
For sure. It's all faith, because when I got to the clerk's office, that was a very good government job. I mean, like, I'll be honest, if I was like not motivated, I would have stayed in that job for 30 years and retired, because they have this thing at the clerk's office called below time. And below time, you accrue it over time. Essentially, they don't pay like overtime at these jobs because you are working more than 9 to 5, right? There were some days I would come in at 8 or 9 and not walk out of that building until 2 or 3 in the morning, right? And so anything past 5 o'clock, you were accruing all of this time. And so when the House is out of session, you're out of session. So depending on the month, you have 2 weeks off, most of July off, all of August you have off. I felt like I was a teacher, but didn't have to deal with the kids.
Exactly. Well, members of Congress.
Exactly.
They're kind of kids sometimes.
So it was a really good job, and the pay was great. I mean, it allowed me to. Well, let me just put it this: the pay was decent. It allowed me to eat, entertain, and pay my bills. Other luxuries you had to sort of plan for, but it was a great sort of Kickstarter, and but for me seeing young Black and brown that's one of the things about DC that I don't want to get lost in the sauce about. DC is one of the few cities where people of color have real power. Mm-hmm. And you don't really find that in too many other cities around the country. And not just power, but influence. Mm-hmm. And so seeing Black and brown men and women walk in the halls of Congress, dressed to the nines, working with different members of Congress, different organizations, and just being movers and shakers, that motivated me. And I was very humble about trying to get to understand how DC worked, how to make it work for people that look like me, and also how to just navigate this space, because I don't know about you, but I didn't grow up around a minority setting. Coming from Brooklyn, everybody was Black or brown for the most part. And so, and I went to a historically Black university. So my first time really dealing with understanding oh, I am a minority was when I got to DC and on Capitol Hill. And I was just like, wow, where all these white people come from? Wow, the numbers are really, really accurate here. Because when I was coming up in Brooklyn, that was all I was accustomed to for the most part, right? I was used to being in settings where I was in the majority and folks elite around the table looked like me and had the same sort of shared experiences. It wasn't until I got to Washington, D.C. and really got around some of these circles where I realized some of the tables and rooms that we need to be in, we were not in.
So that perspective is important, because I grew up in Bushwick on welfare, and in the streets. It wasn't until I left there that I realized, wow, people live in a very different way in other parts of the country. It's just a whole different experience. It's still the United States of America, but it's a completely different world. Completely. The one thing that so my way out of Brooklyn was to join the military at 17. So that was my way out. You took an incredibly courageous path to take on some of these responsibilities. But how about your family? What was your family experience when you took on these roles and said you were moving to DC? They must have been like, really? So
what was their experience? I wouldn't be here without my mother and my father. My father drove a bus for the city for 28 years. But those benefits really allowed me to live and thrive, right? Because he was part of this union, TWU. And then my mom was a teacher and then a school administrator, a guidance counselor. And so, they supported me, 100%. And really, I owe a lot just to them being very focused on myself and my brother, and making sure that some of the outside factors that could snatch up, a young man growing up in the inner city, that they kept us insulated from a lot of that. And you can't do it all. And so you see things growing up that make you make decisions in life. And I was fortunate enough to have that kind of experience, which you can't teach. And having that kind of seasoning really prepares you to get into some of these corporate boardrooms and around people who have different type of microaggressions, because we're very confrontational. And so having the experience of being coming from backgrounds that are very sometimes challenged, you get an understanding of how to maneuver in different spaces, and you can adapt to a lot of different areas.
It's funny, growing up in Brooklyn back in the bad old days, it's a good place to be from, because you get into some of these situations in polite society, and they get flustered, and you're like, this is nothing.
Yeah, this is nothing. This is nothing. a 5-alarm fire, in Brooklyn is different than a 5-alarm fire here. Even how the different emergencies that may pop up within the industry on things, coming from where I'm from, you're able to adapt and handle things under pressure a little bit better, if that makes sense.
They freak out. Oh my God, the report's going to be late. Come on, settle down. It's not an emergency.
We'll be okay.
Let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about EEI and your experience. You've been there for 7 years now?
7 years.
You've seen the energy industry change in a lot of different ways. You've seen them sort of try to adapt to new realities, changing demographics, different policy issues, different, priorities and so forth. Mm-hmm. Give me a little bit about your experience of diving deep into the energy industry at a national level. What's that been like?
It's been eerily similar to working for the Congressional Black Caucus, because I work for a trade association that also has members. And every member is not the same. Every member has a different issue area and subset. But at the end of the day, we're sort of rooted in making sure that we deliver power affordably, reliably, and increasingly more clean, right? And so I have seen, I remember my days on the Hill when our energy mix was upwards of 60+% coal. You flash forward to where we're at now, coal is still a part of the mix, but the focus now is on cleaner burning technologies and zero emitting fuels. And so the industry has done a 180 on its thought process and its thinking around how to make sure that we're delivering power in a more clean, in a more efficient way. And I like being a part of that discussion just with my liberal tendencies.
Mm-hmm. That's an important discussion. The other side of the discussion is also, we've talked about how my company managed the minority internship program for the U.S. Department of Energy for 9 years.
Yes.
Getting a more diverse population into the pipeline of those jobs that, it's a workforce imperative. It's a talent imperative to make sure that we're penetrating those communities in a much more intentional way for the energy sector. What have you seen some of the changes that are taking place within the energy industry in terms of those outreach? Is it successful? Does more need to be done, et cetera?
Yeah, more needs to be done. But I have seen more intentionality from leadership and lay folk alike, right? In 2018, EEI and the board sort of agreed to a commitment to more diversity and to put metrics behind that. Even prior to that commitment, I know that the EEI, NEI, and AGA formulated the Center for Energy Workforce Development to set up different state workforce consortia to build up these pipelines for the jobs of the future, right? And the people that we wanted to target and retain, because retention is a major issue as well, right? In our industry, making sure that the talent that you procure is comfortable in the environment and wants to stay. And so I have seen more of a concerted effort to be intentional about who we hire and bring in, different diverse communities up through the ranks. But obviously more needs to be done. And through groups like the American Association of Blacks in Energy, Hispanics in Energy, and the like, they're creating and curating conversations like this, but also putting money behind scholarships and grant proposals that will help reach back to and target students at an early age to say, hey, this is a pathway, this is a career path for you if you're looking to get into an industry that is innovative and always changing.
Well, the challenge also is, as you know better than I do, is that in many cases, these utility companies are like old, entrenched. They've been there for 120 years, and it's hard
Yeah,
to move
it is hard.
a big old battleship like that into the new reality of the world. So, getting them to move that direction is an incredibly difficult challenge, but also, and not just in terms of the workforce at the operational level, but getting minorities into leadership positions and the C-suite and boards of directors of some of these
Mhm.
companies is a whole other dimension of challenge out there.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I'm hoping to see more progress on that. I think that's happening in some cases, and that's applauded, should be celebrated. But more needs to be done. What do you think about that?
I do. I think more needs to be done. I think we have some leaders of color that are in the industry, that are in the pipeline, in the queue, to ascend to that top job. Because that's, at the end of the day, that's what you want. Right now, we have one Hispanic chairman and CEO of a major investor-owned electric company, and that's Pedro Pizarro from Edison International. And that's it. And so obviously there needs to be more of a focus in this space. I mean, I, for one, even though I am clearly a Black man, I'm very much focused on working with people like Jose Perez at Hispanics and Energy to make sure that there is a pipeline for more Hispanic representation within our industry, because our communities are most acutely affected by some of these energy choices. And I do see that there is a lack of numbers, I should say, in the Hispanic community that are turned on to the opportunities within our industry.
The same holds true for sort of the supplier diversity, the business diversity aspect of it, being able to do contracts and subcontracts with minority-owned companies. I think that's something that I know the Latino Coalition is going to be really interested in working with you on some of that stuff as well. So there's a lot to be done. There's a whole lot more to be done. And just thank you for all of the leadership you're demonstrating in the industry, in a sector that's going to be increasingly important. We know that anything that's going to be moving forward in the future in terms of different sectors and industries and technologies and so forth, it's going to run on the back of energy. Everything's going to need energy, and electricity and power, and it's your sector that's going to be a driving force today and into the future.
I believe that, with all my whole heart. I also believe that some of these new technologies that our industry is starting to delve into. I think it's incumbent upon some of the folks that we work with to help make these new technologies more comfortable for our communities, right? You have a large contingent of folks within our community that obviously have their own cars and vehicles, and now you have these new electric vehicles that are coming on board. You have these fleets that are being electrified. You even have electrified, fully autonomous vehicles that are coming into play, where I saw a YouTube video the other day where a guy hailed a cab. And I don't know if it was a promotion for this particular cab or whether or not it was a bit, but the car was an autonomous vehicle that picked him up and sort of took him on his way. And so, this is the future, and clearly the future is now. And so making sure that these technologies are available and are tangible to communities of color is very important to me.
I appreciate it. Kwame, you're just such an incredible role model, and you're doing such good work, and you're making such a direct impact on lots of different communities. Last question is going to be, if you had one bit of advice to share with folks that want to learn from your experience, what would that one little tidbit of advice be? Your pearls of wisdom.
I would say always stay hungry, right? Never be satisfied, particularly if you are looking to get somewhere. I was very motivated and very hungry, but also humble humble enough to ask. And it's an old saying, but I think it holds true. Closed mouths don't get fed. And so it doesn't hurt to fall on some humility and ask for help in different areas, where you need it. Because I have found in Washington, D.C. in particular, it's really based on relationships. And people are looking to help folks who are hungry and motivated and want to put in the work and the shoe leather. When I first got my first, political appointee job on the Hill from a member of Congress, when I was actually hired back by Mr. Towns, this guy named Alex Beckles taught me two jewels that I will never forget being a DC staffer, and it served me well to this day. Don't be a jerk, and always return emails within 24 hours. Now, he was more colorful when he told me don't be a jerk, but you get the gist, Danny.
Bobby, that's really important advice, and I think it's something that we can all learn from. But I want to thank you, Kwame, for sharing with us today. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your experience. I appreciate you sharing with us. And to everyone watching us and listening to us, on behalf of the Latino Coalition, I want to thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoy the content. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Please join us for future webinars and podcasts. Please keep an eye out for information on our upcoming Latina Prosperity Summit in Miami. I know you want to be there, Kwame. And thank you once again, Kwame, for being our guest today. Thank you all again for joining us. And as always, be safe, aim high, and thrive. We'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.